The lights dimmed inside the Augusta Civic Center as 15,000 fans erupted in anticipation. It was August 12, 1988, and the legendary James Brown was scheduled to take the stage in exactly 30 minutes for what promoters had called the concert of the decade. Outside, the summer heat pressed down on Georgia like a warm blanket, but inside the venue, the air conditioning hummed while road crew members made final adjustments to the sound equipment. Backstage, James stood before a full-length mirror in his dressing room, adjusting the collar of his burgundy suit jacket. At 55 years old, he still moved with the energy of a man half his age, his processed hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His band members warmed up in the adjacent room, the muffled sounds of horns and drums creating a rhythmic backdrop to the pre-show excitement. Danny Ray, his longtime announcer and stage manager, burst through the door with his characteristic enthusiasm, holding the famous cape that would be draped over James's shoulders during the show's climactic moments. "Mr. Brown, the crowd is electric tonight," Danny said, his eyes bright with excitement. "They've been chanting your name for the past 20 minutes. James turned from the mirror and smiled, that familiar sparkle in his eyes that had captivated audiences for 3 decades. "That's what I like to hear, Danny. You know what I always say, give the people what they want, and they'll love you forever. Tonight, we're gonna give them everything we've got." He moved toward the small table, where a pitcher of water sat next to a bowl of fresh fruit, his preferred pre-show refreshment. As he poured himself a glass, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door. Not the casual tap of a crew member, but the authoritative rap that could only come from someone accustomed to demanding attention. Danny and James exchanged glances. Before either could respond, the door swung open to reveal 2 police officers in crisp uniforms, their expressions serious and professional. "James Brown?" the taller officer asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. James set down his water glass carefully, his performer's instinct telling him that something was terribly wrong. "Yes, officer, that's me. Is there a problem?" The officer stepped forward, pulling out a folded document from his breast pocket. "Sir, we have a warrant for your arrest. There are outstanding traffic violations and unpaid fines dating back several months. We need you to come with us." The words hung in the air like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect melody. Danny's mouth fell open in disbelief, and from the adjacent room, the music abruptly stopped as band members sensed something was amiss. James felt his heart pound, but he maintained his composure. Decades of performing under pressure had taught him how to keep his cool in unexpected situations. "Officers, there must be some mistake," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I have 15,000 people out there waiting for me to perform. Can't we resolve this after the concert?" The second officer, shorter and stockier, shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, but we have our orders. The warrant is active, and we need to take you into custody immediately." Within minutes, the dressing room had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. The venue manager arrived, his face flushed with panic, as he tried to negotiate with the officers. James's lawyer, Marcus Webb, who had been watching from the audience, rushed backstage and immediately began making phone calls, his voice rising with urgency as he spoke to judges and city officials. The band members gathered in the hallway, their instruments silent, their faces etched with concern and confusion. "This is insane," muttered Bobby Bird, James's longtime friend and musical collaborator. "He's one of the most famous entertainers in the world, and they're treating him like a common criminal over traffic tickets." Despite the turmoil swirling around him, James remained remarkably calm. He understood that resisting or creating a scene would only make matters worse. He had grown up in poverty in South Carolina, had faced discrimination and hardship throughout his life, and had learned that dignity in difficult moments was more powerful than anger. "Gentlemen," he said to his band, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded stages around the world, "I need you all to stay professional. Don't let this situation become something it doesn't need to be. Marcus will handle the legal matters, and I'll be back before you know it." The officers allowed James a moment to change out of his performance suit and into casual clothes, a simple white shirt and dark slacks. As he folded the burgundy jacket carefully and handed it to Danny, there was a poignant silence in the room. "Take care of that cape, Danny," James said softly, a slight smile crossing his face. "I'm gonna need it when I get back." Danny's eyes glistened with emotion as he clutched the iconic garment. "We'll be waiting for you, Mr. Brown. This whole thing is crazy, but we'll be right here waiting." As James was escorted through the backstage corridors, word spread through the venue like wildfire. Crew members stopped their work to watch in stunned silence as the godfather of soul walked past, flanked by police officers. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here was a man who had performed for presidents, who had used his music to bridge racial divides during the civil rights movement, who had inspired generations of artists, being led away in handcuffs over administrative paperwork. The officers, to their credit, treated him with respect, keeping the handcuffs loose and positioned in front rather than behind his back, a small gesture that James appreciated. Outside the venue, a police car waited in the loading dock area, away from the main entrance where fans were still streaming in, unaware of the drama unfolding backstage. The humid Georgia evening wrapped around them as James was guided into the back seat. Through the tinted windows, he could see the marquee lights spelling out his name in bold letters, James Brown, tonight only. The officers secured him in the vehicle, and as the engine started, James took one last look at the venue. He could feel the vibration of the excited crowd even from here, could almost hear their anticipation. The car pulled away slowly, navigating through the parking lot and onto the main street. James sat back against the seat, his mind racing but his outward demeanor calm. He had faced hostile audiences in the segregated South, had overcome poverty and prejudice, had built an empire from nothing. This was just another challenge, another obstacle to overcome. As the Augusta Civic Center disappeared from view behind them, replaced by the familiar streets of his hometown, James Brown began to mentally prepare himself for whatever lay ahead, never imagining that the next 48 hours would become one of the most transformative experiences of his remarkable life. The Richmond County Detention Center stood as an imposing concrete structure on the eastern edge of Augusta, its utilitarian architecture a stark contrast to the glamorous venues where James Brown typically spent his evenings. As the police car pulled into the secure entrance, James observed the facility through the window with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. He had visited prisons before, not as an inmate but as a performer and motivational speaker, bringing messages of hope and redemption to incarcerated individuals. Now he would experience this world from an entirely different perspective. The processing area was brightly lit and efficiently organized, with officers moving through their routines with practiced precision. James was led to a desk, where a female officer, her nameplate reading Officer Martinez, began the intake process. She looked up from her paperwork, and her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Mr. Brown," she said, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to surprise, "I have to say this is unexpected. My mother has every one of your albums." James offered a warm smile despite his circumstances. "Well, you make sure to tell your mother that James Brown sends his regards, and tell her I'm sorry I missed that concert tonight. I had a prior engagement that couldn't be rescheduled." His humor, gentle and self-deprecating, broke the tension in the room, and Officer Martinez couldn't help but smile as she continued processing his paperwork. The intake procedure was thorough but respectful. James was asked to empty his pockets, remove his watch and rings, and provide basic information for the facility's records. His personal belongings were catalogued and placed in a sealed envelope, a gold watch that had been a gift from Muhammad Ali, a simple wedding ring, a wallet containing several $100s and photographs of his children. Each item represented a piece of his life outside these walls, now temporarily set aside. As Officer Martinez worked through the forms, other officers began to gather nearby, their curiosity evident. Word had spread quickly through the facility that James Brown was being processed, and the atmosphere had shifted from routine to something more charged with interest. "Mr. Brown," Officer Martinez said as she completed the paperwork, "you'll be held in a temporary holding area while your attorney works on resolving this matter. Given the nature of the situation and your cooperation, you won't be placed in general population. We have a separate area for administrative holds." James nodded his appreciation. "I understand, officer. I appreciate your professionalism. I know you're all just doing your jobs." His grace under pressure was evident to everyone in the room, and it set the tone for everything that would follow. The holding area was a small section of the facility with 4 individual cells, each designed to accommodate 1 or 2 people, in situations requiring separation from the main population. James was led to the second cell, a space measuring roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a metal bench that doubled as a bed, a small sink, and a toilet. The walls were painted an institutional beige, and a single fluorescent light fixture provided harsh, constant illumination. A small window near the ceiling offered a narrow view of the darkening sky outside. As the cell door closed with a metallic clang that echoed through the corridor, James stood in the center of the space and took a deep breath. He had performed in magnificent theaters and intimate jazz clubs, in outdoor stadiums and television studios, but never had he found himself in a setting quite like this. Rather than succumbing to frustration or self-pity, he chose to approach this experience with the same curiosity and resilience that had defined his entire career. He sat down on the metal bench and began to mentally organize his thoughts, knowing that his attorney Marcus was working diligently on his release, but also understanding that bureaucracy moved at its own pace, especially on a Friday evening. Time passed slowly in the holding area, marked only by the occasional sound of footsteps in the corridor and the distant echoes of doors opening and closing elsewhere in the facility. James estimated that about an hour had gone by when he heard voices approaching his cell. 2 correctional officers appeared at the door, both younger men in their late 20s or early 30s. The taller one, whose name tag read Officer Thompson, carried a tray with a sandwich, an apple, and a small carton of milk. "Evening meal, Mr. Brown," Thompson said as he unlocked the small slot in the door to pass the tray through. "It's not exactly gourmet, but it's what we've got." James accepted the tray with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, officer. You know, I've eaten in some of the finest restaurants in the world, but I've also known real hunger. Food is food, and I appreciate it." His response was sincere, reflecting memories of his childhood in extreme poverty, when any meal was a blessing. Officer Thompson and his colleague, Officer Rodriguez, lingered at the door for a moment. "Mr. Brown," Rodriguez said hesitantly, "my father saw you perform in 1965 at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. He said it was the greatest show he ever witnessed. He still talks about it." James's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "The Apollo, now that's a special place. That theater has soul in its walls. Your father has good taste. What's his name?" "Miguel Rodriguez," the officer replied. "He emigrated from Puerto Rico in the early 60s, and he said your music helped him feel welcome in America, like he belonged." James stood and approached the door, his presence commanding even in these diminished circumstances. "You tell Miguel that his story means more to me than any award or recognition I've ever received. Music is supposed to bring people together, to break down walls, not build them up. If my music did that for your father, then I've done my job." The 2 officers seemed genuinely moved by James's words, and what began as a routine meal delivery evolved into a conversation. They asked him about his career, about the legends he had worked with, about the civil rights movement and his friendship with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. James, ever the storyteller, shared anecdotes with warmth and humility, never boasting, but instead focusing on the lessons he had learned and the people who had shaped him. "You know," James said at one point, settling back onto the bench with his partially eaten sandwich, "people see the stage persona, the fancy clothes, the elaborate performances, the energy, and they think that's who I am all the time. But that's just one part of the picture. Underneath all of that, I'm just a man who came from nothing and was blessed with a gift that I've tried to honor and share. This situation right here, being in this cell, it reminds me of where I came from. I've been in worse places than this, believe me. When I was a boy in South Carolina, we lived in a shack that barely kept the rain out. My aunt ran a brothel, and I shined shoes on the street to earn pennies. So sitting here tonight, I'm not angry or bitter. I'm actually grateful for everything I've experienced, because it all made me who I am." His philosophical perspective on his circumstances was remarkable, and both officers found themselves drawn into his orbit, captivated not by his celebrity, but by his authentic humanity. As the evening deepened into night, more officers found reasons to pass by James's cell. Some were genuinely checking on his welfare, while others were simply curious to see the famous performer in this unlikely setting. James greeted each one with courtesy and warmth, asking about their lives, their families, their dreams. He seemed genuinely interested in their stories, turning the typical dynamic on its head. Instead of them guarding him, he was ministering to them, offering encouragement and wisdom. Officer Thompson returned around 9 o'clock to collect the dinner tray and check on James's comfort. "Mr. Brown, is there anything we can get you? We want to make sure you're as comfortable as possible given the circumstances." James considered the question thoughtfully. "Well, officer, I don't suppose there's any chance of having something to read. I'm a restless mind, and sitting idle isn't really my style. Even a newspaper would be fine." Thompson nodded. Let me see what I can find. We don't have much of a library here, but I'll look around. He disappeared and returned 15 minutes later with an eclectic collection, a worn Bible, yesterday's edition of the Augusta Chronicle, and a magazine about music production. This is all I could round up on short notice, Thompson said apologetically. James accepted the items with enthusiasm. This is perfect, officer. You've given me treasures here. Thank you kindly. As Thompson walked away, he marveled at how this famous entertainer had transformed what should have been a humiliating experience into something else entirely, a demonstration of grace, gratitude, and unshakable dignity that was affecting everyone who encountered him. The night stretched long inside the Richmond County Detention Center, and as the facility settled into its nocturnal rhythm, James Brown sat on his metal bench, reading by the harsh fluorescent light. He had started with the newspaper, absorbing stories about local events and national politics, then moved to the Bible, finding comfort in familiar passages he had known since childhood. Around 11 o'clock, he heard movement in the corridor. Not the measured footsteps of officers on patrol, but the sound of someone new being brought into the holding area. A young man, perhaps 25 years old, was placed in the cell adjacent to James's. Through the bars, James could see him clearly. Disheveled appearance, hands trembling slightly, eyes red and swollen from crying. The young man sat heavily on his bench and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James set down his reading material and moved closer to the bars that separated their cells. "Hey there, young brother," he said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had comforted millions through his music. "Rough night." The young man looked up, startled, and his eyes widened in disbelief when he recognized his neighbor. You're James Brown," he stammered. "What are you doing here?" James smiled ruefully. "Same thing you're doing, I imagine. Paying the price for some mistakes. What's your name, son?" "Marcus," the young man replied, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Marcus Johnson." "I can't believe James Brown is talking to me right now. My grandmother loves your music. She plays it every Sunday morning while she cooks breakfast." James felt a warmth spread through his chest at the mention of someone's grandmother. "Marcus Johnson. That's a strong name. Your grandmother sounds like a woman of excellent taste. Now, you want to tell me what's got you so upset?" "Sometimes talking helps." Marcus hesitated, then the words began pouring out in a rush. He explained that he had been detained for driving with a suspended license, something he hadn't even known about because he'd moved apartments and missed the notification. He was supposed to start a new job on Monday, his first real opportunity after months of unemployment, and now he feared he would lose it before he even began. "I finally got my life on track," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "I finished my community college degree, got clean from some bad habits, and landed this position at an automotive repair shop. The owner took a chance on me despite my past. And now this happens, and I'm afraid he'll think I'm unreliable and give the job to someone else." James listened intently, nodding with understanding. When Marcus finished, James spoke with the authority of someone who had overcome tremendous obstacles. "Let me tell you something, Marcus. I've made more mistakes in my life than I can count. I've been knocked down so many times that some people lost count. But here's what I learned. It's not about never falling. It's about how you get back up and what you do next." For the next hour, James shared his own story with remarkable candor. He talked about his impoverished childhood, about being sent to juvenile detention as a teenager, about the prejudice and discrimination he faced even after becoming successful. "When I was 16 years old," James said, leaning against the bars, "I was locked up for breaking into cars. I was angry, desperate, and making terrible choices. But while I was incarcerated, I discovered music. Some other inmates and I would sing together, creating harmonies with nothing but our voices. That's where I learned that music could be my salvation, my way out of that life. Your grandmother playing my songs on Sunday mornings. That all started because a confused, scared kid found hope in the darkest place." Marcus listened, transfixed, his earlier despair giving way to something else. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. "But how did you go from that to becoming who you are?" he asked. James chuckled softly. "One step at a time, brother. One good decision after another. I worked harder than anyone else, showed up earlier, stayed later, and never let anyone outwork me. When people doubted me, I proved them wrong with my dedication. When doors closed, I built my own doors. And most importantly, I never forgot where I came from or let my circumstances define my future." He paused, then added with emphasis, That job you're worried about? When you get out of here, and you will get out, you call that shop owner. You explain exactly what happened. You apologize for any inconvenience, and you promise him that he won't regret giving you this opportunity. Then you show up on Monday, if they'll still have you, and you work like your life depends on it. Because in a way, it does. As the night progressed toward morning, other voices began to join the conversation. Officer Thompson, who had been monitoring the holding area, found himself drawn into the discussion. He pulled up a chair outside the cells and shared his own story. How he had taken this job to support his family, but sometimes questioned whether he was making a real difference in people's lives. A maintenance worker named Carl, an older black man who had been cleaning the corridor, stopped his work and added his perspective, talking about the civil rights era and how James's music had provided a soundtrack to his generation's struggle for dignity and equality. "Mr. Brown," Carl said, leaning on his mop handle, "I was at the Boston Garden in 1968, the night after Dr. King passed. The city was ready to explode with anger and grief, but you went on stage and you calmed everyone down. You told us to honor Dr. King's memory by staying peaceful, by staying strong. You probably saved lives that night, and you definitely saved our city from tearing itself apart." James's eyes glistened with emotion at the memory. "That was one of the hardest performances of my life, Carl. My heart was broken just like everyone else's, but I knew that Dr. King wouldn't have wanted violence in his name. Music has power. Not just to entertain, but to heal, to unite, to remind us of our shared humanity." The conversation expanded to encompass larger themes: redemption, second chances, the importance of community, the power of perseverance. James spoke about his philosophy that everyone deserves respect regardless of their circumstances, that dignity is not something conferred by status or wealth, but something inherent in every human being. He talked about his famous insistence on discipline and professionalism with his band members, but explained that this came from a place of love and belief in excellence. "I'm hard on people because I know what they're capable of," he explained. "I push because I care. When I fine a musician for missing a note or being late to rehearsal, it's not about being mean. It's about holding everyone to the standard they deserve to reach. We're all capable of greatness if we commit to it." Marcus, who had been listening intently, spoke up again. "Mr. Brown, I've been feeling so ashamed about being here, like I'm worthless. But hearing you talk, hearing that you've been through struggles too, it makes me realize that this doesn't have to define me." James reached through the bars as far as he could, and Marcus did the same, their fingertips almost touching. "That's exactly right, young brother. This is just a chapter in your story, not the whole book. You write the next chapter starting tomorrow. And remember, I'll be rooting for you. In fact, give me your grandmother's address before we leave here, and I'll send her an autographed record with a note telling her how proud she should be of her grandson." Dawn began to break, pale light filtering through the high window in James's cell. Around 6:30 in the morning, Marcus Webb, James's attorney, arrived with news. The paperwork had been processed, the fines paid, and arrangements made for James's release. Officer Martinez appeared to escort James through the discharge process, and as he gathered his belongings, the gold watch, the wedding ring, the photographs, the reality of his imminent departure settled over the holding area. Marcus Johnson stood at his cell door gripping the bars. "Mr. Brown, I'll never forget this night, never." James turned back, his eyes warm with genuine affection. "You stay strong, Marcus. Remember everything we talked about. And Officer Thompson," he addressed the guard who had shown him such consideration, "you are making a difference. Never doubt that. The way you treat people with respect and dignity, that matters more than you know." As James was led through the facility toward the exit, officers and staff members lined the corridors, not because they had been ordered to, but because they wanted to say goodbye to this remarkable man who had transformed a difficult situation into something meaningful. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded with respect, and a few had tears in their eyes. Word had spread throughout the night about the grace, wisdom, and humanity James had displayed, and it had touched something deep in everyone who encountered him. Outside the detention center, the morning sun was rising over Augusta, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Marcus Webb stood beside a waiting car, relief evident on his face. "James, I'm so sorry this happened. It was a bureaucratic mix-up that should never have escalated this far. We've filed complaints and ensured this won't happen again." James placed a hand on his attorney's shoulder. "Marcus, don't apologize. Last night was one of the most important nights of my life. The lawyer looked confused. Important? How so? James smiled, that familiar sparkle returning to his eyes. I was reminded of who I am beyond the stage, beyond the fame. I was reminded that every person has a story, that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about, and that treating people with respect and dignity costs nothing but means everything. I met some good people in there. People trying their best, people who needed encouragement, people who reminded me why I do what I do. As they drove through Augusta's streets toward James's home, he looked out at the city waking up. People heading to work, children waiting for school buses, the ordinary rhythms of daily life. The concert he had missed the night before seemed less important now, though he knew it would be rescheduled. What mattered was the unexpected gift he had been given. A reminder that his influence extended far beyond his music, that his true legacy was not just the songs he had created, but the lives he had touched with simple human kindness. 3 months later, James Brown returned to the Augusta Civic Center for the rescheduled concert. The venue was packed with fans who had waited patiently for this moment. As he took the stage to thunderous applause, he paused before beginning his first song. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena, "thank you for your patience. A few months ago, I had an unexpected adventure that taught me some valuable lessons. Tonight, I want to dedicate this performance to everyone who's ever faced difficult circumstances, everyone who's ever been knocked down but got back up, and especially to a young man named Marcus Johnson. Brother, I hope you got that job, and I hope your grandmother is listening. This is for all of you." The band launched into "I Got You, I Feel Good," and as James Brown danced across the stage with all the energy and passion that had made him a legend, he carried with him the memory of that night in the detention center, the conversations, the connections, the reminder that true greatness is measured not by fame or fortune, but by how we treat others in our most challenging moments. The guards who had watched over him that night were watching now too, many of them in the audience, having purchased tickets with their own money. They had come not just to see a performance, but to witness the triumph of a man who had shown them that dignity, grace, and humanity could flourish anywhere, even in a jail cell, if we choose to cultivate them. And in that moment, as 15,000 people sang along with the Godfather of Soul, the real magic of James Brown's legacy became clear. It was never just about the music, but about the unbreakable human spirit that the music represented.